Hello and welcome to Whisky.com, where fine spirits meet. Today I'm sitting at the shores of Loch Lomond, and it is a beautiful day. This behind me, the Loch Lomond, is the biggest sweetwater loch in all of Scotland and actually all of Great Britain. Depending on the level of the lake, it has up to 60 islands, and the biggest island you see here in the background is Inchmurrin. It actually has some people on it, so it has 13 inhabitants. And the Loch Lomond is really legendary because of a famous soldier named Donald MacDonald, and he wrote a very famous song, and the song goes, "By ye bonny banks and by ye bonny braes,"
where the sun shines bright on Loch Lomond, where me and my true love were ever wont to gaze, on the bonny banks of Loch Lomond.
In 1964, the distillery Loch Lomond was founded in Alexandria, the southern city on the southern shores of Loch Lomond. It was founded by the Little Mill Distilling Ltd. Little Mill is a distillery that at some point got closed, and then it burned down, was demolished, so there's nothing left of Little Mill except a few casks inside the distillery. The story of Loch Lomond was also a bit of a rough one. It got sold a couple of times to America and back. And in 1984, they actually closed down. They got bought by Glen Catherine Bonded Warehouse in 1984, and they reopened. They continued production, and actually it was very prosperous, and they actually built a new still house. They invested into a coffee still in 1993, and they really got into the blended whiskey market, because in the 90s the blended whiskies were the really big ones on the market. So they sold everything in bulk, did a lot of grain whiskey distilling, but now after the millennium, we tend to go more into the single malt side of the whiskey, and so they got bought in 2014 by four British gentlemen, 3 Scottish and 1 English, and these gentlemen had a new vision, a new direction for the Loch Lomond distillery. They wanted to go more into the single malt market. They went more premium with Loch Lomond because there's actually a lot going on at Loch Lomond that is really unique and really good. So they want to emphasize the single malt and the different single malt brands that Loch Lomond has to offer. And today we're gonna have a look at the distillery, what makes the Loch Lomond whiskey.
Behind me is the Porthouse malt mill. It's an old malt mill from the 19th century, so it's really old. But the whole production of the malt part of Loch Lomond is milled here. So it's really incredible to have such an old mill running for over 100 years to do this kind of work with this much malt. In terms of malt selection, the Loch Lomond distillery committed themselves to do 100% Scottish malt. And yeah, that's really difficult. They get 100% Scottish malt, mostly from Aberdeen, but they have to source it from anywhere in Scotland. And they also can't get it from just one supplier. So they're actually looking at 2 suppliers around the lowlands region. And yeah, it is really difficult, but they're managing to pull through and get 100% Scottish product. This here is the mash tun. It's a big, modern stainless steel mash tun. It's very energy efficient, and it runs on a cycle of 4 times 6 hour shifts. So that means it gives you 24 hours and you have one mashing done every day. It takes about 10 tons of grist to do the mashing, and gives you roughly 50,000 liters of wort that is really sugary and really sweet and nice for the fermentation. So the fermentation process is the process where the mash is turned into wash. The Americans call it beer, which is basically 8%, 9%, 10% beer, which is then distilled. And this is really where the Loch Lomond distillery puts their finesse in it. They really put their brains into this process, because they really want to have a very, very fruity beer. And how they do that is they have a few tricks up their sleeve. The first thing is they don't just use distiller's yeast. Usually the big distillers use the distiller's yeast because it gives you a good yield, it's very stable and everything. But they also use 2 wine yeasts. One Chardonnay wine yeast and one Sauvignon Blanc wine yeast. 2 French wine yeasts. And these yeasts are very, very, very fruity. So they produce a lot of fruity character inside the whiskey. They don't mix the yeast. They do all the batches differently and pure, but they have some batches that have the wine yeast and they are really, really fruity. The other thing how you get a fruity spirit, fruity beer, is you have a long fermentation duration. Normal fermentation is about 40 hours alcoholic fermentation, and afterwards you have malolactic fermentation where the yeast eats itself and produces long esters, a chemical that is known as the flavor ingredients. And these are natural esters that are really, really, really fruity and really round and really, really pleasant to drink. And that's what they're looking for. So they said, okay, we have 40 hours of alcoholic fermentation, then we need a time period to produce these esters. And they said, let's go up to a point where we're surely finished. We have all the nice esters. And they said, okay, let's do 90 hours of fermentation. Yeah, that's a long period of time. Here we have the problem that you have to have an output. And if you have a long duration, you can't have another batch in. So what you need to do at Loch Lomond, you have to have very many fermentation tanks. So they have 21 fermentation tanks with capacities of, some have 25,000 liters, so you have to fill 2 mash tuns, and some have 50,000 liters. And yeah, so they have a lot of fermentation tanks to just keep up that quality. Outside, there are also outside fermentation tanks, and for the unusual event of a hot summer in Scotland, they have also cooling systems, because if you go above 30 degrees Celsius, then you have problems with a fast fermentation, and you might have some flavors that you don't want to have in your beer. So they cool it down. They have a slow fermentation below 30 degrees Celsius, and that gives you the right quality, the right fruitiness, and just a very good start for the distillation. So the still room here is very, very different to normal still rooms. First of all, if you look at the still behind me, you see it's very tubular shaped, and some people think maybe it's a Lomond still. It's not a Lomond still, it's a normal still with a tubular neck with a depth ring. The depth ring is a DEPH, and yes, it is a cooling ring with water cooling, but it's only the very, very top part. You have a water coating which cools down the copper, and there's condensation taking place at the copper. And this means it is increasing the reflux, and if you have more reflux and more condensation, you get a milder spirit. You don't get the sharp tones, the heavy tones, the intense flavors. So when you put on the depth ring, then you have a milder flavor. But Loch Lomond doesn't always turn on the depth ring. So what they do is they have variations. With this depth ring, we already have 2 different kind of spirits. But it doesn't end here. what they also are very keen on are their cutting points. You have the foreshots, which are very faint, very light, and you don't want to have them. They're a bit too alcoholic, like window cleaners. So you have them, you put them in a separate tank, and they're not going into the cask. Then you have the middle cut, which is the right stuff that tastes good, and you want to have that. And then you have the feints, the last peat, the heavy, the oily stuff, the very intense, the very spicy stuff. And depending on when you stop with the middle cut and start the feints that you also put in a separate tank and don't get into the cask, this gives you sometimes if you make it smaller, you get a little lighter spirit, and if you make it longer, then you get a heavier spirit. So they have two different lengths of middle cut, and that means you have two different variations there. With the two different variations of the depth ring, you have 4 different kind of spirits. But it doesn't end here. You have the different kind of ingredients. You have the different malts, different peat levels in malt. You have a heavy peated malt, you have a medium peated malt, and you have a light peated malt. And that means you have 3 variations there. Multiplied with the 4 spirits we had before, you have theoretically 12 different kind of spirits. And in Loch Lomond doesn't do the 12 kind of spirits, they only do 10. But they gave them names. They named them after regional things. The Inchmurrin, the Loch Lomond, you have the Inchmorn, you have different kind of names. So they have these 10 names, and they write down everything to the books. So they have huge lists. When do they run what, and what is definitely inside this spirit tank. But to be fair, you have only 6 weeks of peat, so everything runs on peat now. Then you have a few weeks of medium peated, and then the rest of the year is unpeated. So you have not that bad of a variation, but still the team here has to be very careful. They are highly trained, and they really go with the variations. And what Loch Lomond is getting from that is you have very many possibilities. It's very complicated, definitely. It's very complicated for the master blender. He has so many ingredients he works with, but he has the possibilities, because he has so many ingredients, to create new kind of Loch Lomond whiskey, which is sometimes you want to have a more spicy one. You can combine it with a lighter one to make a very, very interesting Loch Lomond whiskey. Yeah, this was the pot still part, and now we're gonna move on to the column still part. This here is the column still. Loch Lomond was for decades the distillery that was the only distillery with pot stills and column stills in Scotland. It is a 6-story tall column stills, but it's only a 3-story high building. How do you get a 6-story column still into a 3-story building? You just cut it in half. So we have 2 halves of 3-story column stills, which are interconnected. Now comes the question, which one is the bottom, which one is the top? The left one is the bottom, and the right one is the top. So the top of the left one is connected to the bottom of the right one. And in the left one, you see these little lines going out left and right. And this is where the alcohol is just separated, so it's the right middle cut, the right hard piece, the right kind of spirit. So you have a few collection plates, and they're all being mixed together, and you get about 1,000 liters of raw spirit at 84% alcohol by volume. Yeah, it is run 100% with malt. This is a rather small column still, and it's run 100% malt. But due to Scottish law, you are not allowed to call it single malt whiskey, because single malt whiskey is now defined as a pot still spirit. In Scotland, you have to distill on pot stills to call it single malt. This is why they're not calling this malt, 100% malt, a single malt. But it gives Loch Lomond the possibility to have grain whiskey, single grain whiskey, which is really nice. It's a a light spirit they can mix with their other types of whiskies, and it gives it even more variation to have a really nice Loch Lomond whiskey. Loch Lomond also has a cooperage. It's a bit noisy in here and a bit dirty, but here is where the casks are being repaired and being recharred. In the back you see the recharring of a cask. They have two different depths of charring. They do the medium and they do the heavy char. They don't have the system like the Americans with number 2, 3, 4 alligator char, but they do a medium char. What it does is it rejuvenates the cask. You have more caramelized sugars within the staves, and you have a better maturation than if you would just reuse the cask just normally. What they also do is they do repairs. Here's one of the damaged staves. You see there's something sharp just hit the cask and you have cracks in there. This might lead to leaks or a damaged cask, and you might lose whiskey during the process. This is really not what you want. So what they do is they have about 10,000 repairs per year and 10,000 recharring of the casks. And now we go off to the warehouse and see how the whiskey is being matured.
So I'm standing here in one of the warehouses of Loch Lomond. And if you see behind me, you see a lot of similar casks. And that's because they don't use these different casks. They don't use sherry and wine casks mainly for their expressions. They really tend to go with bourbon barrels and hogsheads, first fill and second fill, because they are really fond of what they did in the production side, and they're really fond of their distillery character. So you see a lot of similar casks here stacked on a palletized warehouse. It's the most efficient way to store your whiskey. They're stored up to 8 pallets high. At the sides you're only allowed to go 6 pallets, and they do a minimum maturation here of 12 years. So they have 12 years palletized. They just store it in, they wait for 12 years, forget about the pallets, and then after 12 years they take out the pallets. Some of them get bottled immediately, but then they get re-racked into other warehouses, and in these warehouses you have the older expressions like the 15-year-old, the 18-year-old, and during that time you have a closer look at the cask. But during the minimum maturation it's just store in and forget about it, because whiskey takes time. This was about it with the making of the whiskey, and now we're gonna have a look at 3 of their expressions and gonna have a little talk with their master blender. So I'm sitting here with Michael Henry, and you have been 12 years with Loch Lomond, but you've been 20 years in the whiskey business and also beer business. Thank you very much for having us here.
You're welcome.
And so it's a lovely distillery, and not such a lovely day, but
probably a real Scottish kind of weather day.
So what are we having today?
My first whiskey we'll taste today is the Loch Lomond 12-year-old. So it's bottled at 46%, non-chill filtered. The Loch Lomond 12, because it carries the name of the distillery, we make it as representative of the distillery as we can. So we use 4 spirit styles in it to give it a very balanced flavour profile. So there'll be some sweetness, some fruit, and a light touch of peat coming through in the finish.
So what is there in terms of wood? What did you use?
The wood, it's all American oak matured. So the majority would be refill American oak hogsheads, then a small amount of first fill bourbon and a small amount of first fill recharred casks from our cooperage.
It's more full bodied than I would have expected. And there's this bit of peat in it.
So the the peat is there just to add a little more body and just come through in the finish. So when you're tasting it, you're tasting the fruit that we get from our fermentations and our straight neck pot stills. And then that's balanced by like a kind of biscuity sweet vanilla from the American oak maturation, and then you have that light touch of peat coming through on the finish.
I would have expected much more light touch. You do have the fruit, you do have the peat, but there's a good amount of body in there. And I would have expected less oak, but I like it. It's intriguing. You yearn for more.
Well, so with our whiskies, we look to kind of show more the distillery character. So with each of the whiskies that we taste today, the main character comes from how it's been distilled rather than from the wood. You'll hear distillers talk about anything 50 to 80% of the character comes from wood. For these, I would say probably about 30% from the wood and 70% from the distillery.
Nice. So, as a master blender, for my viewers to know, you don't just do blends, you also do the single malt.
Yeah.
How many different single malts have you done? Because you've seen a lot of brands and you see a lot of different specialties. How many did you do?
So I look after Loch Lomond, Glen Scotia and Little Mill distilleries.
Okay.
So I cover the core ranges as well as like limited and special editions. So probably over say 30 single malts over the last 4 years. That would be on top of the kind of blends that we do.
Does that include the special editions?
No.
Okay, so then even more special editions.
Yeah.
You stopped counting?
Yeah, so it's you kind of look more forward than back because there's always new expressions that we're working on. Like we have probably most of my work goes into the core range. That's what most people taste. So that's what we kind of focus on. But you do need to give people something new all the time to keep their interest. So with Loch Lomond, we have like the open editions every year. With Glen Scotia, we have the festival edition every year. So while we concentrate mostly on the core expressions, we do have sort of annual special editions coming out.
So different brands. We have now tasted Loch Lomond. Next up is Inchmurrin.
Inchmurrin, 12-year-old.
What can I expect from that?
Okay, so while the Loch Lomond 12 had a really balanced flavour that kind of is representative of the whole distillery, the Inchmurrin, what we tried to do with this is to show like our fruitiest expression. So it's really what we want to give people here is the fruit character that we achieve with the way we've selected our yeast for like ester production, how we use a longer fermentation to allow the yeast to create fruit character, but also for a secondary bacterial fermentation.
Yeah, this one has a lot of apple in it, and a bit of pear, but I'm not quite sure if it's red apples or green apples or both, or
it's sort of peach, pear, apples, and then we create all these wonderful fruit characters in fermentation, but then with our straight neck stills, collected at the high strength. They're very good at selecting this fruit character and creating a new mixed spirit that's very light, very fruity. So this expression is 100% from our straight neck pot stills collected at 85% strength. So it's a very tight cut on the spirit run.
Yeah, I've gone through your production, and you have types of yeast. You have this the death neck. You have the different cuts, and obviously you do have a bit of variation in wood. And so, how much? What's your palette to work with? How much variation do you have?
Well, by varying the peat content, the malt, yeast type, distillation style, we produce 11 different characters of single malt that we can then use by themselves, or we can combine, because it's all from the one distillery. It's all single malt, so we can use any combination. So that's 11 different flavors before you get to wood types. So that's our standard production. We then do kind of more special runs. So once or twice a year we'll do runs on wine yeast fermentations, and there we use kind of a wine yeast that we tried, and we probably took about 10 different wine yeast strains before we got one that really worked for us. And we run that for maybe 2 weeks at a time, and then we reserve that stock for specialist bottlings.
So this is incredible. Is that really hard? Does that make your job more difficult, or makes it more easy? Because
it probably, although we're working with single malts, it makes it more like you're working with a blend, because you have, rather than 20 distilleries to manage the stocks from a blend, we have all that variation, but it's all from one distillery. So it's probably more like managing or producing a blend rather than a single malt, from how we handle the variation.
Interesting. So your different distillates have different names. Is that mostly Inchmurren then?
Yeah. We find that the names were more for internal use.
Okay.
So we would know, we're on this style today or this style tomorrow. We find, because of the complexity that's there, it's hard for, when you go out to speak to people who are drinking the whiskies, you need a long time to explain to them what each name means.
Okay.
So
yeah, these are the brands for us.
Try to kind of make it clearer to people what the names mean. So we've kind of tried to simplify it a bit more. So we've gone with Loch Lomond for a balanced flavour, Inchmurren for a fruity style, and Inchmone for a peated style.
Okay, yeah, I want to say both of them 12 years. Is the next one now going to be a lot different?
Yeah, so this is also a 12-year.
These ones were full-bodied and lighter, fruity.
So this is Inchmone 12-year-old. Inchmone is an island on Loch Lomond. The name translates from Scotch Gaelic as Island of Peat. So this is the fully peated expression.
Oh, yeah, it's full peated.
We actually use all 50 ppm phenol malted barley for this. However, we distill it 3 different ways. So when we distill the 50 ppm phenol malt in our traditional pot stills, we get kind of phenolic medicinal character that you would associate with an Islay whiskey. When you distill it in the straight neck pot stills collected at low strength, you get more smoky character. And then when you distill in the straight neck pot stills collected at high strength, you get a very spicy character because you're stripping out all the heavier phenols.
I love it. It's you have a lot of complexity in the draft.
What we've tried to do here is we distill the 3 different types individually, we mature individually, and then we combine together after 12 years in a proportion that brings down the phenolic character, keeps the smokiness, and brings out more spiciness. So you get a very balanced peat profile.
I do love it. It has a lot of different flavors in it.
And that's if when you're tasting peat that's distilled in swan neck stills, the bigger phenols dominate the taste, so that kind of medicinal phenolic character then hides the spiciness. So we've done this to show that by distilling peat differently, you can create different flavors with it.
The thing is, I love it because of the complexity. It just you taste into it, and you have a bit of a slightly character of phenolic, and you have a bit of a bonfire note going on, a bit of a normal smoky note. But the thing is, you really can't pinpoint it. It just moves around on its own. So we've seen a lot of your expressions. My question is, why do you use no sherry or wine finishes?
Well, what we try to do with Loch Lomond, using these 3 12-year-olds as an example, the 3 whiskies we tasted today, they're all the same age, they're all the same wood profile, so it's all the same casks. So we get that balance, the fruit and the peat are all from the distillery. So it's all really how you, the distillery character that we've looked to show more of. And that kind of distillery character works better with American oak. And we use American oak to give like a background sweetness, so that the main flavour is coming from the distillery and how we distill, rather than sherry cask, which are quite a strong wood influence.
So you don't want to just take out your hard work that you set into your 11 different kind of spirit. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a good reason.
Like if you take the Inchmurrin, you know, that the fruit character that we get on that is kind of similar to the sherry, because the sherry does give you a lot of fruit floral notes.
A light sherry, I would say.
Yeah.
If you have a sherry with European oak, that will be
more spice,
more spicy and deeper. But I like it. I like it how you can have so much variation in it. I love it. That's what I love about the whiskey industry. You have the tradition, you have the innovation, you have so much variation. I love it.
So with that, with the tradition and understanding that comes from whiskey, you can use that to control your distillations to produce a consistent character, or you can use that same knowledge to introduce new flavours, and that's what we do at Loch Lomond. We use that understanding of yeast, fermentation, distillation to create flavour in the distillery.
Lovely. So yeah, I think we're through.
Okay.
Thank you very much for all the answers and introducing me to the Loch Lomond. Thanks for showing us around.
So thank you for coming in to see us today.
Okay, yeah. And thank you all for watching. If you found this video interesting, then please feel free to share it with your friends. And if you're ever in the region around Glasgow, the Loch Lomond Lake is really, really lovely. And yeah, go find the Loch Lomond, it's the other brands. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time.